Let's bring in our panel now. Joining me now in Geneva is Babar Baloch, the UN Refugee Agency's spokesman for Africa. In London, we have human rights lawyer Lucia Kula, who's been focusing her research on Congolese refugees in Angola. And in Chicago is historian Marrisa Moorman, who's written extensively on Angola and conducts her research out of Indiana University. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Lucia, let me begin with you. Before we even talk about what awaits these people in Kasai province, even if Kasai was peaceful, the mere fact that Angola is kicking them out, is it a bad idea?
It's definitely a bad idea. I think we all know that as a sovereign nation, Angola has signed treaties such as the African Charter of People's Rights. They are abide by the international law to protect those seeking refuge and those fleeing conflict. And then also we're talking about mass expulsion. So we're under international law, it's not allowed for such a large number of people to be expelled from a country at once. So it is very much an interesting phenomenon what's happening in Angola now.
Okay, Babar Baloch, as UNHCR, you guys are telling them don't do it, but they're not listening. Tell us what your biggest fears are.
I mean, as you heard the legal point of view, it also has a humanitarian point of view as well. I mean, look at the misery this has brought to over 300,000 people that were expelled and were removed and asked to leave Angola in a very short time frame. So we have been really concerned by this, and also a lot of human rights abuses that have come with this, a lot of forceful evictions that we have heard, and we have heard about human rights violations on the both sides of the border, not only in Angola, while people had to leave within 2 weeks, had to pack whatever they could get with themselves. There were women, there were children, a lot of family separations that have happened. So that's why we're saying mass expulsions should be avoided because of the legal aspect as well, and also with what human tragedies it brings. And as you mentioned, Kasai region is still in a very fragile state now. It has been a complex picture of displacement. Some people have been able to go back, but with over 300,000 people arriving there with no support, it's really difficult, and we are worried that it could lead to a humanitarian crisis in the region.
Marrisa Moorman, the Angolans are saying these people were illegal immigrants, most were working illegally as minors, and that a lot of those people are suspected of diamond smuggling. Do you have any sympathy whatsoever for the Angolan position?
I think I understand what they're trying to do, but I don't have sympathy for it. I think this is part of a long history of tensions between the Congolese and the Angolans, as well as a long history of cooperation along political lines at great cost to average people.
And now,
so
go ahead.
I just said the new president's facing a very complex political and economic situation, and so he's beating a drum that's quite familiar to me here in the United States, complaining that immigrants are taking jobs away from Angolans.
Right.
So I think that's a kind of discourse of which we should be suspicious.
Okay, so interesting. So Joao Lorenzo sort of, appealing to populist sentiment domestically. Lucia, let's talk a little bit about Kasai now, because we have in July the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture Worldwide, Nils Melzer, comparing this potentially to Rwanda and Srebrenica, saying a genocide could happen soon. Is it that bad?
It is that bad. This is a region that has been unstable for many years. There is proof of violence, sexual violence, killings, arbitrary killings and arbitrary violence committed against women and children. And to expel such a large number to a region that is so unstable only destabilizes that region even more. So when we're talking about Kasai, we need to understand that this is a region that is still suffering from the aftermaths of violence and conflict within the DRC. And this is not the first time that such a large number of people have been expelled to the region from Angola. 2015 and 2011, similar things have happened. Some of these people returned to Angola afterwards, and this is just creating a very vicious cycle of returning irregular migrants, refugees who are fleeing violence and conflict.
So, Babar Baloch, you work within the system at the UN, and this is an interesting perspective to get from you, because if it can be ascertained that you have a country knowingly sending hundreds of thousands of people out of the frying pan and into the fire, if we know for sure what's happening in Kasai is just so horribly bad, isn't this something that then needs to be taken up at, I guess, the UN Security Council?
As we were talking about, mass expulsions and removal of people is prohibited under international law, under the Charter of African Human and People's Rights as well. And also, look what brings with itself. I mean, we are asking people to leave in a short span of time. They haven't been through the due process in terms of knowing what's happening in the DRC in general overall, Kasai as well. There may be people who are in need of international protection. So cases should have been reviewed on individual basis. Families should not have been separated in this. I mean, I was talking to my colleagues, the border town inside DRC of Kamako, which had 20,000 people as its population, is now struggling with around 160,000. Many of these people are out in the street. They need food, water, shelter, and humanitarians are trying to gather whatever we can assist them with. But let's not forget that Kasai was already a picture of displacement, where there were 1.4 million at some stage displaced people have returned home, and they are now sharing their resources with these people. So in general, it just adds up to the complexities and strains the system on the other side in the DRC. It should have been avoided at the first place.
Yeah, so Marrisa, we're not necessarily going to discuss the technicalities of international law here, but is it theoretically, at the very least, and morally, a form of a war crime to knowingly hurl people back into hell? I mean, we've heard of cannibalism, we've heard of dismemberment of civilians in Kasai over the past 2 years. To knowingly push people back into that, is it a war crime?
I'm not a specialist in legal questions, but I would say it certainly is irresponsible. And it's certainly something of concern, especially for Angola, which was part of the UN Human Rights Committee. And this is they're really doing it for political reasons. This is an area largely controlled by the generals, where diamond mining is controlled by the generals. And for example, in the local press over the weekend, in the independent press, there was a cartoon suggesting that, this is a temporary measure, that these people will come back as workers again. As I think Lucia rightly pointed out, this has happened before. There are deportations and then people come back. It's a question of political expediency in terms of the discourse, and then making the generals happy, the generals who control most of the production of diamonds in this region under awful conditions.
Okay, and Lucia, who gets to step in here and hold the Angolan government accountable, or even the DRC? Is it the AU? Does the AU have the capability?
I think the AU certainly has the capability, but a lot has to do with international pressure, both from the other African states and from the EU and other Western countries. I think we need to understand that this whole populist approach to migratory movements between borders, specifically in regions where there's a lot of conflict, comes from a very Western narrative of closing off borders to your neighbors, closing off borders to people who are fleeing violence. So if we want to direct some kind of accountability to these states, both the DRC and Angola, we need to put international pressure for them to actually abide by the international treaties they have signed.
And I just want to kind of take the concept of international pressure and international appeals and ask Babar, when we look at last year, the World Food Programme, at that point in time, when they looked at the region, particularly Kasai, they said that they only received 1% of that which they needed to keep people alive in the region, to keep people from starvation and so forth. That does suggest that there isn't a lot of desire from the international community to get involved in DRC or Angola or the border. Is that a fact?
Indeed, international support is needed for a really desperate situation inside the DRC, and especially when we are talking about Kasai. Let's not forget, refugees have been crossing into Angola. We have over 30,000 refugees from the recent episode of the conflict in the past few years that refugees went and took refuge there. Overall, Angola has 68,000 refugees. But inside DRC, there's a lot of help that is required. We at UNHCR, we are struggling with resources as well. Overall operations being funded around 40% of what we need. It's really a struggle to provide people humanitarian assistance. And in a situation like this, where we have to move fast, act fast, and provide shelter, food, water, and all basic necessities of life, if we don't have resources, we won't be able to do much for these desperate people.
Yeah, Marrisa, the hardest question for you, why is there the lack of appetite to even care about what's going on, whether in the DRC or in the border regions with Angola?
I think that Angola, for many years, the Angolan government fought a war. You know, they were engaged in a civil war that was amplified by the Cold War. They had just come out of an anti-colonial war, and there was little respect or concern ever shown for humanitarian questions. Millions of people died in Angola's civil war. And so I don't think we should be surprised that they're not particularly concerned about a humanitarian issue outside the question of optics. They are concerned about that. The new president, with whose position I'm sympathetic, it's a complicated situation, and he's trying to do things, but he's also just been to Europe, and he's looking for international support. He's looking for economic investment. So to the extent that he is worried about support, I think he's concerned with the discourse around these deportations. So he's careful to speak with the UN authorities inside the country and things like that. Yeah. And he's not going to want bad international attention. Yeah. So, but I think it's surprising that this isn't a priority for them.
Right. So Lucia, the Angolans want international investment. International investors sense opportunity. The country produces 1.7 million barrels of oil per day. Are human rights sacrificed at the altar of big business when it comes to Angola?
Definitely. I think it's been a historical fact that Angola has prioritized economic gain, in specific oil and diamond mining, with regards to human rights. The abuses that are happening in the northern part of the countries are nothing new, as Melissa has mentioned. This is something that has been occurring in the north, specifically on the border between the DRC and Angola. This is a region that is very much controlled by private sectors, the military, and no one wants the attention to that region. No one wants to have international attention and international pressure on what's happening in the region. So for us to look away from what's happening in the DRC and also look away from what's happening between the border in the DRC and Angola is very much a failure from the international community on holding Angola and the government accountable for the violations being committed.
Okay, well, I'm glad we had an opportunity to shed some light on the issue. Babar Baloch, Lucia Kula, and Marrisa Moorman, I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers.